Welcome to SDG and Features Talk Dekalogo series, a conversation using multidisciplinary approach towards the realization of sustainable development goals using foresight and features thinking as handles. I'm Lizan Karina. Today in this episode, I am joined by our research fellows, Dr. Jalton Taguibao, Dr. Rebullida, and Dr. Eduardo Gonzalez to discuss with us their paper entitled Enhancing Advocacies for National Local Governance of Sustainable Consumption and Production. We would like to begin with a very key concept on what is sustainable consumption and production. Our resource persons will be very glad to share with us their insights and ideas. Let's start with Dr. Malu.
We would like to think of sustainable consumption and production as a word that is anchored, lodged in a bigger word that we refer to as sustainable development. We can produce more goods, more services that people, inhabitants of this planet Earth would need, but we would do it with the least amount or volume of natural resources. We conserve, we protect, we promote the resources that we have now so that our future generations will still have something to use.
Would you like to add on that, Dr. Jalton?
The intention is really to address the need, first and foremost, to know patterns of consumption and production and to ensure that these patterns are sustainable. The research that we conducted, which specifically focuses on SDG 12.5, really zeroing in on the issue of waste management and also particularly the prevention in using too many resources to manage to help reuse, recycle, and even ensure that the consumption patterns are really according to principles that are environmentally safe and for the security of our ecology.
Dr. Ed?
As individuals, we have obligation to make sure that we don't waste our resources. To the extent possible, we're able to recycle, rehabilitate some of our maybe assets. But at the community level, it's much more important to make sure that we can exchange notes, innovations that would lead to a better use of our resources. Resources that should be part of a renewable kind of structure.
What inspired you to pursue this research study?
This has been an advocacy for many people in civil society, non-government organizations, communities, as far back as the 1990s and decade of the 2000s. That was even prior to the legislation of Republic Act 9003 in 2000, which is the Ecological Solid Waste Management Act. We begin to notice that our environment is getting dirtier. The air quality is getting poorer. One of these major causes is identified to come from solid waste. In common language, basically it's garbage. So there's garbage all around. And sometime in that decade, you have the trash slide in Payatas, with many people, living in that area, which is really the dump site, getting buried under the trash. And for which reason, that spurred the legislation of ecological solid waste management. But as we go along, especially with COVID-19, we have more wastes. We have different kinds of waste, medical waste, masks, etc. And then you see so many consumer products. They are all in plastics. They're all in different sizes. We question where will all of these go? And with climate change and environmental degradation, we can point to this wastes as a target for our intervention.
We are in a world where there is ambiguity, there's uncertainty, and therefore there's a need really to make sure that we can address this in very concrete ways, not just do lip service, trying to make sure that our environment is safe and well protected against risks.
Dr. Jalton, what inspired you?
My previous research actually focuses on sustainable energy and sustainable consumption and production, or touches on this particular research focus that I did. That was one of the many convincing reasons why I guess we went together and came together as a research team. More importantly, the very idea of sustainable consumption and production as a sustainable development goal really touches on the other SDGs. So when you talk about issues pertaining to improving public health or improving quality of life or ensuring that cities are innovative, you can see here these different dimensions that actually interact. Sustainable consumption and production is a unifying concept, or is an intersection of these different dimensions and these different SDGs.
As a unifying factor for cities and municipalities, and of course, all other government agencies to become more agile and features ready. But especially at the local level, we are faced by problems like garbage, a lot, as mentioned by Dr. Malu. And in your paper, you talk about solid waste management. So how is it connected with SCP and also within the context of the Mandanas ruling?
There is a general way of thinking that when we deal with real world issues, we compartmentalize them. When in fact, these issues are all interrelated. We might think that this is just an infrastructure issue, or we might think that it is just an administration issue, but it actually interacts with others. It's an ecological, environmental, it's a public health issue. And so by conducting this research and focusing on solid waste management, at least to our research, we were able to find, first and foremost, a number of local initiatives that are select, or a number of local government units who are already heeding the call to address SCP issues. We also found out policies and principles that are already there, however, that require localization and operationalization.
In the paper, we encountered technical terms like decoupling and circular economy approach. How are we going to operationalize this to be useful for policymakers?
When it comes to decoupling, it would mean that we'll have a sustainable economy, but with the use of less resources. This is not about reducing growth. This is about maintaining growth, but with the use of less resources, less water, less minerals. But how do we do it? Because right now, starting the 20th century, we see a situation where more and more resources are being used to the point where the use and utilization of these resources have exceeded even our economic growth. Actually, it's so easy to think about making sure that we have to maintain that kind of, not reduce growth, but to maintain that kind of growth, simply by saying we have means to make sure that our resources can be more efficiently used, that there could be more productivity with the use of less resources, right? So that's the way to do it. Certain countries are already in that kind of mode, but globally speaking, unfortunately, we're not into that yet. In fact, the so-called dematerialization or the lowering of the use of our materials is something that we promised in our nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement on climate change.
I would like to add the word responsible. I think we have to be responsible how to use resources and allocate resources. Of course, we have to look at the next generation. And we're talking about sustainable development, meaning to say that we really have to not only apply, but also really promote the so-called intergenerational responsibility doctrine. And I think that's really fitting with a sustainable consumption.
That responsibility should take place not only on the part of the consumer, the person using the goods and services. That should happen at the production stage. Like you have manufacturing plants, you have business establishments, you have households, whatever they produce there. The question is, can you reduce the resources, the materials that will go into what service or product you're going to create? That means, can you reuse what you have used before? Can you recover from whatever you think you've thrown away at the production side? Then when the product or the service is created, it will go to the consumer. The question to the consumer is, can you reduce the waste that you will throw away to the landfill? How do you do that? Whatever you have already consumed, can you still recover a new purpose for it? Can you recycle it? Can you reuse it? So it doesn't just go right away into the garbage collector and into the landfill or wherever it is that you're going to have a final repository of our garbage.
And it reminds me of best practices in other countries. Like, for
Mm.
example, when they manufacture fruits, for example, no, there's no waste at all
Yes.
because they have this drying mechanism. They have dried fruits and then no waste at all.
No
Because,
waste,
Yeah,
yeah.
they're very responsible and it's really sustainable. And I think in the Philippines, do we have registered best practices that we can look at it as a reference for future policies?
There are a number of cases that already exhibited or at least demonstrated initiatives moving towards that direction. For example, we have local governments now who have been really recognized for institutionalizing mechanisms for recycling, materials recovery. We have local governments who have really exerted efforts so that dump sites will be closed and landfills will be lessened. I think what I'd also like to add with sustainable consumption and production is that the role of the local government, for example, in the coming years when the expectations in the interventions coming from the local government is now heightened because of the Mandanas Garcia ruling and because of devolution, there's really a lot of expectation in the next years and decades of government playing this pivotal role of providing this environment so that responsible, sustainable consumption and production can be realized.
Given this firm background on sustainable consumption and production, I'd like to get your insights and perspectives on how will this research study be functional and practical for our policymakers?
There are a few things that we need to keep in mind. First is that we don't have specific targets yet. When we look at the value chain, for example, from sourcing and extraction of materials to production, and then post-production, and then consumption, and then of course post-consumption, which is of course the disposal of waste. We don't have very specific targets that will guide the LGUs, for example, in trying to make sure these targets are met. The second is, to the extent possible, we need to decentralize SCP. It cannot be just the national government trying to dictate what should be done. Each individual LGU has its own way of thinking, and they should be given more autonomy in terms of checking what would be most appropriate in the communities that they serve. Finally, I think the business sector. Of course, the LGUs and even the national government still has the responsibility of making sure that you have the right kind of legislation when it comes to SCP that will prod the private sector. So in other words, we need more business models that are resource efficient, that raises productivity, and therefore contribute a lot to sustainable consumption and production.
So those are good points you raised, Dr. Ed, earlier about no specific targets. Maybe we can help LGUs on this one, and likewise on the decentralization of SCP. This is not a popular concept for them right now. What other practical tips would you like to share, Dr. Malu?
In the first place, before setting the targets, we need to know what are the types of wastes that must be reduced. So you have food waste, because in communities within the LGUs, you have business establishments, food establishments. So how do we measure the food waste that gets out of it? You have biodegradable and non-biodegradable waste. So the LGUs can be assisted by experts who can do waste characterization. Then, of course, you have water bottles, shampoo bottles, and cooking oil bottles. So you identify what are the types of wastes that you need to reduce and determine that for their materials recovery facility. That should be reduced over time. And what are the policies that can allow for buyback? Like in some other countries, you know, the users, the consumers can bring the bottles, the containers to the mall or some other place where they can get some incentive for what they're returning. And that goes back to the manufacturer. So if we can increase that, buyback centers and recycling centers, and even legitimizing or allowing junk shops.
And in your research paper, you mentioned about policy coherence. Of course, talking about collaborative work, what else can you add on that, Dr. Jal?
Our research identified a number of action areas, especially for local interventions at the local level. Local governments can, in the area of research and development, have interventions that are applicable or appropriate to their local context. Local governments can put up or institutionalize literacy programs just to help local residents to not just be aware of SCP, but to incorporate this as part of local practice and even turn this into local culture. It's really the lack of data that will help us check, that will help local government units monitor the progress of their SCP interventions, even the earlier efforts. I think that in this particular case, collaborative information system is really needed. And it's not just SCP, this actually extends to information systems for purposes of tracking and checking the progress and status of all SDGs at the local level. One finding, at least, of this research was that if you look for standardized measures or standardized data, even the setting up or the design of these information systems, those are the things that are really lacking.
Speaking about local culture,
Local culture.
this is really all about changing mindset. We need to have a paradigm shift when it comes to responsible and sustainable consumption and production. And I think this study will really pave the way for local government units to enact an ordinance, the policy that is backed up by research. The study is here, so this is evidence-based. From this study, we can craft policies.
Let me focus also on what we can do as individuals.
Yeah.
There's this movement against fast fashion, because in fast fashion, you buy your clothes, use them maybe a few times, and then discard them, and that contributes to the waste. The movement says we should shift to slow fashion. In other words, why not buy more expensive clothes, but they're organically made and they use natural materials rather than materials that have harmed the environment.
This reminds me again of the new policy wherein the Civil Service Commission encourages us to use Philippine tropical fibers. And in my conversation with our local artists who are producing tinalak, for example, so there are different colors there. And I asked, how do you process this? They really get it from a tree. We are not giving much attention to our local artists producing natural and organic fibers in the country. So we have to go back to the basic, and Dr. Ed mentioned slow fashion.
I think the points there to remember would be number one, minimize the use of original natural resources so you can preserve what is there. And if you are consuming minimal, you can work at replenishing. So whatever you use, you also replenish the natural resource. And whatever you have used, then you can repurpose, reuse until the last possible stage where that material can be used. It becomes a lifestyle and it becomes a way of thinking.
This is a very good conversation, and I think our listeners and viewers were able to get very remarkable insights from all of you who are experts in the field. And not only that, I hope they're inspired with your research study, both for practicality and functionality, and likewise as a policy tool. They can use this for their plans and policies in the local government units and as well as at the national government agencies. So thank you so much, Dr. Jal, Dr. Malu, and
Thank you
Dr. Ed, for sharing your insights. And this is really part of knowledge co-creation and democratizing sustainable development goals. And we have to go beyond 2030. Thank you so much. So until our next episode, we'll have to talk about other sustainable development goals that we have outlined. For you to get a copy of the full text of the research paper, we'll be flashing on screen the QR code so that you can download the entire research studies conducted by our research fellows.